some betrayals don't storm the gates. They quietly unlock them from the inside. This isn't a story about a thief stealing a document or a foreign mole waiting years for the perfect moment. This is about the worst kind of breach, internal architecture betrayal, the kind that comes from the very people trusted not just to read the plan but to hold the entire operation together. This was Operation Epic Fury. It wasn't a team in the way you might imagine. It was a coordination cell. Just 7 people, pulled from the highest levels of joint staff planning, defense intelligence, and the obscure interagency authorities that turn grand strategy into real-world action. Their job was to synchronize the invisible parts of modern warfare, satellite collection windows, troop movements, diplomatic cover, and the targeting logic that absolutely cannot be wrong, not even once. They knew what was true, what was assumed, and what could never, ever be allowed to leak, and 2 of them were selling it. Not to one buyer, but to 2 separate adversaries, China and Iran. They ran 2 different pipelines, used 2 different sets of tradecraft, and fed different pieces of the same puzzle to their handlers. It was a mosaic of betrayal, and it only made sense if you understood how our enemies build their intelligence pictures. China wasn't interested in ideology. They were buying timelines and our force posture where our assets would be, and when Iran wasn't buying logistics, they were buying our intent, the rationale behind our targets, and crucially, the identities of the human sources who helped build that target list in the first place. When you put those fragments together, you don't just get a stolen file. You get a functional, predictive map of a U.S. operation designed to land with absolute, devastating surprise. With just 11 days left on the clock before execution, the FBI realized the unimaginable. The coordination cell was compromised. The case didn't start with Epic Fury, though. It began where most counterintelligence operations do when there are no confessions and no tips, with money. Specifically, money that doesn't match the life it's funding. The FBI's National Security Division runs continuous anomaly screening on personnel with the highest security clearances, people with top secret or C access and planning authority, the ones who can shift the world by moving a date on a calendar. This system generates thousands of low-level alerts a year. Most are nothing. A house sale, an inheritance, a forgotten investment that finally paid off. They're explained and closed out quickly. But one alert, late that winter, refused to go away. A senior planning officer, one of the 7 members of the Epic Fury cell, had received a series of 4 payments over 18 months. The total came to $340,000. It wasn't a bonus, a settlement, or any declared outside income. The source was a shadowy offshore holding company structured to look as boring as possible, International Consulting. Its registered agent was a law firm with virtually no public footprint. The alert was escalated on a Tuesday to an analyst who knew that sometimes boring is the most expensive disguise money can buy. The analyst took the holding company and cross-referenced its entire service chain, bank routing data, incorporation timing, legal reps against a classified index shared across intelligence agencies. This index tracks the financial infrastructure used by foreign powers. And there it was, a single hit. The law firm had appeared just one other time, in a classified 2019 report detailing the compensation structures used by Chinese intelligence cutouts. These were the shell companies they used to pay Western sources without leaving any direct fingerprints. One hit isn't proof. But in counterintelligence, one hit is a thread, and the job of a counterintelligence officer is to pull on that thread until the fabric either holds firm or rips wide open. By Thursday, the FBI had opened a full compartmented investigation under the tightest access rules possible. The case was codenamed Fractured Lantern, only 11 people were reading. No one in the Epic Fury chain of command was told who the target was. The officer's security permissions weren't changed, his badge wasn't deactivated, and there were no sudden, suspicious interviews. He continued his work, completely unaware. That was the entire point. You can't catch a coordinated betrayal by spooking it. You have to get close and watch it breathe. Surveillance began immediately, layered in 3 dimensions: physical teams for eyes on coverage, financial reconstruction to map every dollar, and deep digital forensics, authorized by a secret court order that allowed the FBI to map the target's covert communications while he still believed his digital world was secure. What they found in that first week shattered their initial theory. The planning officer wasn't the mastermind. He was just a user, operating a system that had been built for him. His communications were too clean, too standardized. He was following a protocol. He used encrypted platforms, but with a second, sophisticated layer of obfuscation. This layer routed his messages through a series of relay points in different countries before they reached a final destination that had no commercial footprint. This wasn't some privacy enthusiast setup. This was professional tradecraft. The planning officer knew how to operate the system, which buttons to press and when, but he clearly hadn't designed it. Someone far more skilled had handed him the keys. The FBI now knew they weren't just hunting a traitor. They were hunting a ghost, the architect of the entire network. And they had to find him before Operation Epic Fury self-destructed. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. When a spy is caught, the first question is always the same: are they the source or just a symptom? In this case, the task force knew the planning officer they'd identified was just a symptom. The real work began now, tracing the architecture of the betrayal backward, piece by piece. This meant time, something the calendar was desperately short on. It took 9 excruciating days, with technical help from the NSA, to carefully unwind the complex web of digital relays without alerting their target. When the trace finally resolved, it didn't lead to a server in a foreign country. It led right back inside the building, to a second device. On paper, this device was registered to another member of that same 7-person coordination cell, a colonel. 17 years of distinguished service, a string of combat deployments. His personnel file was so decorated it looked like a recruiting brochure. This is the exact profile that makes investigators pause, that fraction of a second of doubt. But in the world of counterintelligence, you learn a hard lesson. The most dangerous trait in an insider isn't greed or ideology. It's credibility. The investigation quickly confirmed the colonel had been active for far longer than the planning officer. As they dug into his finances, the scale of the operation exploded. This wasn't just about the $340,000 they'd found initially. The real number was closer to $1.1 million, laundered over 4 years through a labyrinth of shell companies and intermediaries, all designed to fool a casual audit. The colonel wasn't just another pawn receiving payments. He was a manager. He had built the entire system. He had recruited the planning officer, creating a divided workflow where each man was responsible for leaking a different stream of information. The planning officer's data stream went to China. It was tactical, logistics schedules, troop movement windows, adjustments to force positions, and the subtle diplomatic signals that always precede military action. But the colonel's stream, the one he handled personally, went to Iran. And its contents were far more strategic, far more devastating. He was sending the entire framework of the operation, the rationale behind the targeting, the mechanics of coordinating with allies. And then there was the most sensitive element of all. He was leaking the identity category of a crucial human source, an asset whose intelligence was the very foundation of the operation's target database. He didn't send a name. He sent something far more useful to an enemy counterintelligence service: the source's access type, their institutional placement, their windows of activity. It was a description so precise it could shrink a pool of thousands of potential suspects down to a handful, a number you could count on one hand without even writing it down. This detail triggered a frantic parallel emergency. The human source inside Iran's weapons program had already been extracted once before, just 2 months prior, after an unrelated security scare. A new cover had been painstakingly built, and the source had been sent back in. Now, the colonel's leak had torn that wound wide open again. The National Security Council was briefed immediately. A second, high-risk extraction protocol was activated. The timeline for the main operation, codenamed Epic Fury, was already razor-thin. This new crisis squeezed it even further. The clock was turning cruel. The operation was now just 11 days away from its final decision point. It would either go forward or the delay itself would become a message to the world that something was wrong. In the world of intelligence, sometimes postponement shouts louder than any action. But the task force had another, more immediate problem. The planning cell had 7 people. 2 were now confirmed traitors. That left 5 unknowns. You simply don't arrest 2 members of a small critical planning team unless you are absolutely certain you are not leaving a third spy sitting at their terminal, ready to send a warning. The second the arrests go down, but full integrity assessments, the deep dives into finances, behavior, and communications take time. Time they didn't have, so they made the decision that no one ever likes, but everyone in this line of work recognizes is sometimes necessary. They would compress the assessments, accepting a higher risk of missing something, and build contingency plans in case new evidence surfaced after the arrests. They ran the accelerated reviews. In parallel, a non-stop, 6-day sprint of intense scrutiny. For 3 of the 5 who had access to a particularly sensitive subcompartment of the targeting database, they set up a controlled technical operation. A canary trap. A canary trap is a classic intelligence technique. They created a modified document, seeded it into a limited access folder, and embedded it with unique digital markers. These markers were completely invisible to a normal user, but would be glaringly obvious if the document ever appeared in a stream of stolen data. Then they waited. They watched for the one thing that would confirm another compromised node. Their marked document showing up somewhere it should never, ever be. None of the 5 transmitted it. None of them showed the suspicious financial patterns that pointed to long-term foreign payment. And none of them used the complex communication architecture that the colonel and the planning officer had relied on. The task force concluded, with high confidence but with explicit caveats written into the report, that the compromise was contained to the 2 individuals. High confidence isn't certainty, it's simply the best you can buy with time you don't have. With that, the arrest planning became its own intricate operation within the larger operation. Both targets, the colonel and the planning officer, still had full access to all classified systems. Any sudden change, any visible shift in their permissions could trigger an immediate data dump, a final panic transmission to their handlers. So the solution wasn't to restrict them, it was to watch their every move without being seen. The NSA embedded a passive monitoring system deep within the network, far below the user-facing layer of the operating system. There were no logs the targets could audit, no alerts they could possibly see. It gave the task force real-time visibility into every single file they opened, every database query they ran, every message they composed. For 1 full week, the task force watched them. They watched these 2 men move through the classified environment. Completely oblivious, it was like watching 2 people walk through a building that had been completely rewired while they slept. With every footstep, every turn of a doorknob being monitored from a hidden room. Their time was running out. Thanks for watching. If you found this deep dive into the world of counterintelligence fascinating, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories from the hidden world of espionage. See you next time. The task force watched the sequence end to end. Access time, document hash, extraction behavior, outbound packet timing, relay chain, terminus. Every digital footprint was cataloged. The evidentiary chain was complete. That night, the authorization came down from the top. Arrests at first light at 6:45 a.m. Thursday, 2. Teams moved into 2 separate facilities in the national capital region. The colonel was at his workstation on the 3rd floor when the agents entered, 4 of them. He looked up at them, then glanced at his screen, then back. There was no frantic movement, no reach for a phone or a panic button. When the lead agent stated the nature of the arrest, the colonel paused for about 4 seconds and then said, "I want an attorney." That was it. No performance of shock, no dramatic denial. The planning officer was taken into custody in a common area before he could even log in. This timing wasn't a courtesy. It was pure risk management. Surveillance had shown that the planning officer displayed micro-patterns of agitation, tiny signs of anxiety that suggested he might attempt one final desperate transmission if he was cornered at a terminal. Intercepting him pre-login slammed that last-second window shut by 6:58 a.m. Both men were in custody. Simultaneously, the NSA executed pre-staged disruption actions against both of their communications architectures. It was a swift digital decapitation, severing the relay chains before either foreign service could reach out, warn anyone else, or trigger their own emergency procedures. The game board was being cleared piece by piece. The Chinese handler for the planning officer's channel was identified. They were operating under diplomatic cover in a 3rd country. Formal notifications began moving through channels that you won't find on any public map. Within 72 hours, that handler's diplomatic cover was no longer usable. Their career as a spy was effectively over. The Iranian handler, the one linked to the colonel's stream of stolen data, was a trickier target. they were operating under non-official cover in Europe, making them much harder to neutralize quickly. By the time host country services were briefed, the handler was already mobile, a ghost in the wind. That hunt became its own separate, high-stakes lane of the operation. The colonel and the planning officer were the parts of the problem that could be put in handcuffs. The vast, shadowy networks behind them were not so easily contained. But there was another, even more urgent emergency in play. 40 minutes before the two defendants were loaded into federal vehicles, the task force received the confirmation they had been desperately waiting for. The human source was out, extracted alive for the second time. The method used is classified. The route they took is classified. The final destination is classified. What matters, what is absolutely critical to understand, is the sequencing decision the task force made the night before. If the extraction had failed, the arrests would have been delayed. Why? Because arresting the coordinators in the US while the source was still inside Iran was deemed an unacceptable risk to their life. There was a chance the network disruption would be detected through some unknown channel, a digital echo that could sign their death warrant. The rule was absolute: source first, then arrests. In that morning's timeline, those 40 minutes between the source being safe and the arrests going down mattered more than the last 4 years of the colonel's military career. The charges came fast: espionage, conspiracy, transmission of national defense information. For the colonel, there was additional legal exposure tied to the compromise of the human source identity architecture itself, an element with sentencing weight so severe that parts of the charging rationale remained sealed from public view. For the planning officer, there were parallel counts under major espionage provisions, with the most serious charge carrying a potential life sentence. Their lawyers argued for bail, citing distinguished service records and a lack of any prior criminal history. The requests were denied. The reason is standard in cases like this. If someone can successfully maintain a covert, multi-year relationship with a foreign intelligence service while passing security reviews and presenting as a normal, loyal officer, then no monitoring condition can ever be considered sufficient to ensure they won't try to flee or do more damage. Trial dates were not immediately set. The work had to continue. The Special Operations Cell, codenamed Epic Fury, was reconstituted. Parameters were rebuilt where exposure was likely. Allied partners were rebriefed under even tighter security protocols. The operation proceeded. What happened next is classified, but what is known is that it did not collapse. It was protected, saved at the last possible moment by an investigation that began with a single number that just didn't fit. And that is the part of this story that never feels cinematic until you truly understand the stakes. Real-world counterintelligence isn't usually dramatic car chases or rooftop shootouts. It's a quiet, painstaking discipline of noticing things: one suspicious holding company, one obscure law firm, one database reference that showed up in the wrong place at the wrong time. It all comes down to one analyst who looked at an anomalous alert and didn't just clear it to make it go away. They dug deeper. That's how an outlier operation like this survives. Not by luck, not by heroic speeches, but by routine work done with an uncommon, relentless seriousness. Because in the world where Epic Fury lives, a single, seemingly insignificant wire transfer can be the first tremor before a massive earthquake. Let's look at the numbers. For wire transfers over 18 months, totaling $340,000, were tied to the planning officer's channel. Approximately $1.1 million were reconstructed across for years, all tied to the colonel, two different foreign intelligence services running separate pipelines into the same 7-person cell. It took 19 hours from the moment a document was securely accessed on a U.S. server to its receipt by a foreign power on the Iranian stream. There were only 11 days left on the execution window for the operation when the compromise was finally confirmed. The human source had to be extracted twice in just 8 weeks, and there were those 40 critical minutes between the confirmation that the source was out and the arrest teams moving in. All of this entire sprawling, high-stakes global drama came from one single thread. One financial anomaly flag that someone decided was worth a second look. Everything came from that. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the smallest details can have the most profound consequences. Thanks for watching. If you found this look into the hidden world of counterintelligence fascinating, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into stories that matter. See you next time.